I'm live. I'm live. I'm alive. Today is Monday. It's the 12th of July. And I'm reading chapter 4 of the book Life in the World Unseen by Anthony Borgia, who lived his life as Monsignor Robert Hugh Benson, and he was the son of Edward White Benson, former Archbishop of Canterbury. This is an old book. It's about, 60 years old. I cannot see when it was published. It was published here in England. I've read the other chapters already, preface and foreword and so on. And this is now chapter 4, and it's entitled Home of Rest. As we walked along, at least two of us pondered upon what we had seen and its implications. Our young friend, who told us her name was Ruth, put a number of questions to us, but I withheld any attempt to answer, since I was but a newcomer myself, in favour of my friend, whose name, Edwin, I have omitted to give so far. Ruth, it appeared, had never been an active churchgoer whilst on earth, but she was a kindly soul, as it was plain to see, and it was plain to see also that her abstention from church-going had made no difference to her ultimate destination as viewed by the earth. Her service to others had done more for her spiritual welfare than all the outward display of congregational religion, which so often is, but outward display, like myself, she was very surprised to find here in spirit the complete paraphernalia of orthodox religion. Edward told her that she had only seen one example of it so far, and there were plenty of others. Having seen this, however, one had seen them all, more or less. Each denomination, of course, holds to its own particular creed and formularies, such as it had been on earth, with a few minor differences, as we had just seen. Such spiritual somnolence is no novelty in spirit. The earth world is to blame. Religious contention and controversies are at the bottom of all the ignorance and lack of knowledge that so many people bring with them into the spirit world. And if the minds of such people are stubborn, and they are unable really to think for themselves, then do they remain shackled to their narrow religious views, thinking it to be all the truth, until a day of spiritual awakening dawns for them. Then they will see that their slavish adherence to their creeds is holding them back. It is to be so much lamented that for everyone who leaves forever these misguided congregation, another will come to fill its place, until the time comes when the whole earth knows the truth of the world of spirit. Of course, they do no harm as they are here, beyond retarding their own spiritual progression. Once they realize what they are doing to themselves and take the first step forward, their joy knows no bounds. They will realize the time they have apparently wasted. Now, it may be asked if, with the acquisition of knowledge and truth, these extensions of earthly religions into the spirit world are better done away with. What will you put in their place? It sounds like a condemnation of communal worship. By no means. We have our communal worship here, but it is purged of every trace of meaningless creed, of doctrines and dogmas. We worship the great and eternal Father in truth, absolute truth. We are of one mind and one mind only, and no one is called upon to believe blindly, or to profess to do so, something which is utterly incomprehensible to any mind. There are many, many things here which we do not understand, and it will take eons of time before we even have a faint gleam of understanding them. But we are not asked to understand them. We are asked to take them as they are. It makes no difference whatever to our soul's progression. We shall be able to progress far, and far beyond that, before we shall ever need to think about understanding such things. So we have one mind in our worship of the all-highest. Such are the matters we discussed. It was Edwin who expounded, as we walked along in the beautiful air of God's heaven. Ruth espied a rather stately building set among some well-wooded grounds, which also aroused my curiosity. On appealing to our guide, Edward told us that it was a home of rest for those who had come into spirit after long illness, or who had had a violent passing and who were in consequence suffering from shock. We wondered if it would be possible to peep inside without appearing to be a curiosity seeker. He assured us that it would be quite in order to do so, as he had given his services there and was therefore persona grata. Added to which was the fact that he knew we had that necessary sympathy which would banish any thought of inquisitiveness. As we drew near, I could see that the building was in no sense a hospital in outward semblance, whatever its function might be. It was built in the classical style, 2 or 3 stories high, and was entirely open all sides. That is to say, it contained no windows as we know them on earth. It was white in colour as far as the materials of its composition were concerned, but immediately above it there was to be seen a great shaft of blue light, descending upon and enveloping the whole building with its radiance, the effect of which was to give a striking blue tinge to the whole edifice. This great ray was the downpouring of life, a healing ray, sent to those who had already passed here, but who were not yet awake. When they were fully restored to spiritual health, there would be a splendid awakening, and they would be introduced into their new land. I noticed that there was quite a number of people seated upon the grass in the grounds, or walking about. They were relatives and friends of those who were undergoing treatment within the Hall of Rest, and whose awakening was imminent. Although doubtless they would have been summoned upon the instant when necessary, yet, following their old earthly instinct, they preferred to wait close at hand for the happy moment. They were all supremely joyful and very excited, as it would be seen by the expressions on their faces, and many were the friendly smiles we received as we walked among them. Many of them, too, came forward to welcome us amongst them, thinking that we had come for the same reason as themselves. We told them of our true purpose, however, and they sped us on our way. I observed that most of the people waiting in the gardens were not habited in their earth clothes, and I assumed that most of them had been in spirit for some considerable time. Such was not necessarily the case, Edwin told us. They had the right to wear their spirit robes by virtue of the fact that they were inhabitants of this realm we were in now, and the robes they wore were eminently suited to both the place and the situation. It is difficult to describe this costume, because so much rests in being able to give some comparison with a particularly earthly fabric. Here we have no such materials, and all outward appearances are produced not by the texture of the material, but the kind and degree of light that is the essence of a spirit robe. Those that we now saw were in flowing form and of full length, and the colours, blue and pink in varying degrees of intensity, seemed to interweave themselves throughout the whole substance of the robes. They looked very comfortable to wear, and like everything here, they require no attention to keep them in a state of perfect preservation, the spirituality of the wearer alone accounting for that. The 3 of us were still wearing our earthly style of raiment, and Edwin suggested that for our present purposes we might change to our natural element in the matter of clothes. I was quite willing, of course, to fall in with any suggestion that he might like to make, as I turned to him for everything in my lack of knowledge. Ruth also seemed very keen to try this change, but the question that puzzled us both was how it was to be accomplished. Possibly there are people on the earth plane who are willing to believe that such a situation as this would involve the ceremony of being formally presented with a spirit robe in the presence of a godly gathering of celestial beings who had come to witness the bestowing of our heavenly reward, and to be officially invited to take our eternal rest. Let me hasten to say that such was most emphatically not the case. What did take place was simply this. Immediately I had expressed the wish to follow Edwin's suggestion of discarding my earthly style of clothes. Those very clothes faded away, dissolved, and I was attired in my own particular spirit robe, of the same description as those I could see about me. Edwin had changed likewise, and I noticed that this seemed to send out a greater strength of colour than mine. Ruth was the same as mine, and needless to say, she was full of joyful delight with this new manifestation of the spirit. My old friend had experienced the change before, so his costume was not new to him. But speaking for myself, and I'm sure for Ruth, I never at any moment felt the slightest embarrassment or strangeness or self-consciousness in this revolutionary, as it might seem to be, alteration in our external appearance. On the contrary, it seemed quite natural and perfectly in order, and unquestionably it was in proper keeping with our present surroundings. The more so, as I soon discovered, when we walked into the home of rest. Nothing would have been more incongruous than earthly apparel in such a building, which in its interior disposition and accommodations was totally unlike anything to be seen upon the earth plane. As we entered, Edwin was greeted as an old friend by one who came forward to meet us. He briefly explained his mission and our presence there, and we made welcome to see all that we wished. We were made welcome to see all that we wished. An outer vestibule led into a lofty hall of considerable dimensions. The space that would ordinarily be devoted to windows was occupied by tall pillars set some distance apart, and this arrangement was carried out throughout all four walls. There was very little in the way of interior decoration, but it must be supposed from this that the apartment had a cold, barrack-like appearance. It was anything but that. The floor was carpeted with some very soft covering and a sober design, and here and there a handsomely wrought tapestry was hanging upon the walls. Occupying the whole of the floor space were extremely comfortably looking couches, each of which bore a recumbent form, quite still and obviously sleeping profoundly. Moving quietly about were a number of men and women intent upon watching the different couches and their burdens. I noticed as soon as we entered this hall that we came under the influence of the blue ray, and its effect was one of pronounced energizing as well as tranquility. Another noticeable quality was the entire absence of any idea of an institution with its inevitable officialdom. There was no question of patronage, nor did I feel the least shade of being amongst strangers. Those in attendance upon the sleepers did so, not in the attitude of a certain task to be done willy-nilly, but as though they were performing a labour of love in the sheer joy of doing it. Such indeed was precisely the case. The glad awakening of these sleeping souls was an ever-recurrent joy to them, no less than to the people who had come to witness it. I learned that all the patients in this particular hall had gone through lingering illnesses before passing over. Immediately after their dissolution, they are sent gently into a deep sleep. In some cases, the sleep follows instantly, or practically without break, upon the physical death. Long illness prior to passing into the spirit world has debilitating effect upon the mind, which in turn has its influence upon the spirit body. The latter is not serious, but the mind requires absolute rest of varying durations. Each case is treated individually and eventually responds perfectly to its treatment. During this sleep state, the mind is completely resting. There are no unpleasant dreams or fevers of delirium. While gazing upon this perfect manifestation of divine providence, the thought came to me of those absurd earthly notions of eternal rest, everlasting sleep, and the many other equally foolish earthly conceptions, and I wondered if, by some chance or other, this sleep I was now beholding had been distorted by earthly minds into a state of eternal slumber, whither all souls pass at dissolution, there to await in countless years' time the awful last day, the dread day of judgment. Here was the visible refutation of such a senseless belief. Neither of my two friends had awakened in this or other hall of rest, so they told me. Like myself, they had suffered no lengthy illness, and the end of their earth lives had come quite quickly and quite pleasantly. The patients resting upon their couches looked very peaceful. Constant watches kept upon them, and at first fluttering of returning consciousness others are summoned, and all is ready for the full awakening. Some will wake up partially and then sink back into a slumber. Others will shake off their sleep at once, and it is then that those experienced souls in attendance will have perhaps their most difficult task. Until that moment, in fact, it had been mostly a matter of watching and waiting. In so many cases it had to be explained to the newly awakened soul that he had died and is alive. They will remember usually their long illness, but some are quite unaware that they have passed over into spirit. And when the true state of affairs has been gently and quietly explained to them, they often have an urgent desire to go back to the earth, perhaps to those who are sorrowing, perhaps to those for whose care and welfare they had been responsible. They are told that nothing can be done by their going back, and that others of experience will take care of those circumstances that are so distressing them. Such awakenings are not happy ones by comparison with those who wake up with a full realization of what has taken place. Were the earth more enlightened, this would be the more often the case, and there would be a great deal less distress to the newly awakened soul. The earth world thinks itself very advanced, very civilized. Such estimation is begotten of blind ignorance. The earth world, with all things appertaining thereto, is looked upon as of the very first importance, and the spirit world is regarded as something dim and distant. When a soul finally arrives here, it is quite time enough to begin thinking about it. Until that time comes, there is no need even to bother about it. That is the attitude of mind of thousands upon thousands of incarnate souls. And here, in this hall of rest, we witnessed people awakening from their spirit sleep. We saw kind and patient spirits trying so hard to convince these same people that they had really died. And this hall of rest is but one place out of many where the same service is being carried on unceasingly. And all because the earth world is so very superior in knowledge. We were shown another large hall similarly appointed, where those whose passing had been sudden and violent were also in their temporary sleep. These cases were usually more difficult to manage than those we have just seen. The suddenness of their departure added far greater confusion to the mind. Instead of a steady transition, the spirit world had in many cases been forcibly ejected from the physical body and precipitated into the spirit world. The passing over had been so sudden that there seemed to them to be no break in their lives. Some people are taken in hand quickly by bands of souls who devote all their time and the whole of their energies to such work. And in the hall of rest, we could now see the result of their labors. Had so many of these souls had but a small knowledge of spirit matters, these awakenings would have been so much happier. I do assure you, it is not a pleasant sight to see these gentle, patient helpers wrestling mentally and sometimes almost physically with people who are wholly ignorant of the fact that they are dead. It is a most saddening sight, which I can vouch for from first-hand evidence, for have I not seen it? And who is to blame for this state of affairs? Most of these souls blame themselves when they have been here long enough to appreciate their new condition, or alternatively, they blame the world they have but recently left for tolerating such blindness and stupidity. Edwin hinted that perhaps we had seen all that we wished, and truth to tell, both Ruth and I were not sorry to leave, for it must be recalled that we were both comparatively new arrivals, and we had not yet sufficient experience to be able to withstand sights that were in themselves distressing. So we passed out into the open again, and we took a path that skirted a large orchard of fruit trees, similar to those, though much more extensive than that wherein I had had my first taste of celestial fruit. It was close at hand for the use of the newly awakened, and of course for anyone else who wished to partake of the stimulating fruit. It occurred to me that Edwin was expending a good deal of his time upon us, perhaps at the expense of his own work, but he told us that what he was now doing was, in many respects, his usual work, not only to help people to become accustomed to their new surroundings, but to help those who were just beginning to shake off their old religious ideas and break away from the stifling of their minds as members of Orthodox communities here. I was glad to know this, because it meant that he would continue to be our cicerone, guide, I suppose. Now that we were again in the open, the question arose, would we continue to wear our spirit dress, or should we go back to our old attire? As far as Ruth was concerned, she would not hear of any changing back. She declared her perfect satisfaction with what she was wearing, and demanded of us to know what possible earthly costume could ever improve upon it. In the face of such a powerful argument, we were bound to submit. But what of Edwin and me? My friend had only reverted to his earthly cassock to keep me company and to help me feel at home, and so I decided that I would stay as I now was, in my spirit apparel. As we walked along, we fell to chatting about the various earthly notions touching the personal appearance of spirit people. Ruth mentioned wings in connection with angelic beings, and we were all at once agreed that such an idea was nothing less than preposterous. Could any means of locomotion be more clumsy or ponderous or thoroughly unpracticable? We suppose that artists of ancient days must have been largely responsible for this wide departure from actuality. One presumes they thought that some means of personal locomotion was essential for spirit people, and that the ordinary mundane method of using one's legs was far too earthly to be admitted, even as a remote possibility, into the heavenly realms. Having no knowledge whatever of the power of thought here, and its direct application in the literal movement of ourselves through these realms, they were thrown back upon the only means of movement through space known to them, the use of wings. One wonders if there are still earth people who really believe that we are only partly removed from some form of large bird. Among the thinking, modern science has managed to dispel some of the absurd conceptions so long prevalent. We had not gone very far when Edwin bethought him that we might like to make our way to the city, which we could see plainly not too far away. I say not too far away, but that should not be misunderstood into meaning that distance here is of any account. It certainly is not. I mean that the city lay sufficiently close for us to visit it without making any deviation from our general direction. Ruth and I agreed at once that we should like to proceed there forthwith, as a city of the spirit world must be something of a new revelation to us in itself. Then the question came to our minds, should we walk or should we employ a faster method? We both felt that we should like to try exactly what the power of thought can do. But as before, in other circumstances, we were both devoid of any knowledge of how to put these forces into action. Edwin told us that once we had performed this very simple process of thinking, we should have no difficulty whatever in the future. In the first place, it was necessary to have confidence, and in the second, our concentration of thought must not be a half-hearted affair. To borrow an earthly illusion, we wish ourselves there, whatever it may be, and there we shall find ourselves. For the first few occasions it may be required to make something of a conscious effort. Afterwards we can move ourselves whithersoever we wish, one might almost say without thinking. To recall earthly methods when you wish to sit down or walk or perform any of the many earthly actions that are so familiar, you're not conscious of making any very definite effort of thought in order to bring about your desires. The thought very rapidly passes through your mind that you wish to sit down, and you sit down. But you have given no heed to the many muscular movements and so on involved in the simple action. They have become a second nature, and so it is precisely the same with us here. We must think that we wish to be in a certain place, and we are here. We are there. I must of course qualify that statement by saying that all places are not open to us here. There are many realms where we are not able to enter, except in very special circumstances, or only if our state of progression permits. That, however, does not affect the method of locomotion here. It merely restricts us in a certain well-defined direction. Being severely practical, I mentioned to Edwin that as we wished, all three of us, to be together, then must we not all wish to be at the same place, and must we not have some very definite locality in mind upon which to fasten our thought? He replied that there were several factors to be borne in mind in this particular instance. One factor was that it was our initial essay in thought locomotion, and that we would more or less take charge of us. That he would more or less take charge of us. We should automatically remain in close contact with each other, since we had voiced the wish and intention of doing so. These two facts together were sufficient to afford us a safe and sure arrival in company at our desired destination. When we became quite proficient in these methods, we should have no difficulty in this connection. It must be remembered that thought is as instantaneous as it is possible to imagine, and there is no possibility of our losing ourselves in illimitable space. I had had my first example of travelling through space in this way immediately after my passing, but then I had moved comparatively slowly with my eyes firmly closed. Edwin then suggested that it would give us some pleasant amusement if we were to try an experiment for ourselves. He assured us that we could not in any circumstances come to any harm whatever. He proposed that Ruth and I should project ourselves to a small clump of trees lying about a quarter of a mile away, as measured by the earth. We all three sat on the grass, and we gazed at our objective. He suggested that if we felt at all nervous, that we might hold each other's hands. Ruth and I were to go alone, while he would remain on the grass. We were just to think that we wished to be beside yonder trees. We looked at one another with great deal of merriment, both of us wondering what would happen next, and neither of us taking the initiative. We were pondering thus when Edwin said, "Off you go." His remark must have supplied the requisite stimulus, for I took Ruth's hand, and the next thing we knew, we found ourselves standing beneath the trees. We looked at one another, if not in amazement, then in something that was very much like it. Casting our eyes whence we had just come, we saw Edwin waving his hand to us. Then a strange thing happened. We both beheld immediately before our faces what seemed to be a flash of light. It was not blinding, nor did it startle us in any way. It simply caught our attention, just as the earthly sun would do when coming from behind a cloud. It illumined the small place before our eyes as we stood there. We remained quite still, full of expectancy of what might transpire. Then, clearly beyond any vestige of doubt, we heard, whether with the ear or with the mind, I could not say, the voice of Edwin asking if we had enjoyed our brief journey, and to go along back to him in exactly the same way as we had just left him. We both made some remark upon what we had heard, trying to decide if it were really Edwin we had heard speaking. Scarcely had we mentioned our perplexity at this latest demonstration of the spirit, when Edwin's voice broke again, assuring us that he had heard us as we cogitated upon the matter. So surprised and altogether delighted were we with this fresh manifestation of the power of thought, following so swiftly upon the other, that we determined to return to Edwin upon the instant and demand a full explanation. We repeated the procedure, and there we were, once more seated each side of my old friend, who was laughing joyously at our wonderment. He was prepared for the onslaught that came, for we bombarded him with questions, and he told us that he had purposely kept his surprise for us. He said Here was another instance of the correctness of thought, concreteness of thought. If we can move ourselves by the power of thought, then it follows that we should also be able to send our thoughts by themselves, unhindered by all ideas of distance. When we focus our thoughts upon some person in the spirit world, whether they be in the form of a definite message, or whether they are solely for an affectionate nature, those thoughts will reach their destination without fail, and they will be taken up by the by the receiver. That is what happens in the spirit world. How it happens, I'm not prepared to say. That is another of the many things we take as we find and rejoice therein. We had so far used our organs of speech in conversing with each other. It was quite natural, and we hardly gave the matter any thought. It had not occurred either to Ruth or myself that some means of communication at a distance must be available here. We were no longer limited by earthly conditions, yet so far we had not observed anything that would take place by the usual mode of intercommunication upon the earth. This very absence should, perhaps, have told us to expect the unexpected. Although we can thus send our thoughts, it must not be assumed that our minds are as an open book for all to read. By no means. We can, if so we will, deliberately keep our thoughts to ourselves. But if we should think idly, as it were, if we should just let our thoughts ramble along under a loose control, then they can be seen and read by others. One of the first things to be done upon arrival here is to realize that the thought is concrete, that it can create and build. And then our next effort is to place our own thoughts under proper and adequate control. But like so much else in the spirit world, we can soon learn to adjust ourselves to the new conditions if we have a mind to do so, and we shall never lack the most willing helpers in any or all of our difficulties. The latter Ruth and I had already found out with relief and gratitude. Ruth was by now very impatient to be off to visit the city, and she insisted that Edwin should take us there immediately. And so, without further delay, we rose up from the grass, and with a word from our guide, we set forth. That's the ending of chapter 4. I hope you're enjoying it. Bye.